hear me well?
Okay. Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Zoom Cartography. It's a great pleasure for us today to welcome Professor Xavier Villalba. Today, a professor at Universidade Autônoma de Barcelona and co-funded research project, the interpretation of functional categories, expressive meaning in meaning hierarchies. He received his PhD from Universidade Autônoma de Barcelona in 2000. He received his PhD, his current interest are in the interface of syntax with information structure with focus location and semantics with focus on exclamative and existential sentence. Professor Villalba, you have an hour to give his conference, which is entitled The Left Periphery of Non-Finite Relatives and Interrogatives in Mass. Thank you very much to be here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing now the screen. Okay, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to give this talk with this very enormous audience around the world by means of YouTube and the other people joining this Zoom Cartography. What I'm presenting today here is part of a current work. I've been working on this for maybe 4 or 5 years, and I'm still trying to find out many small details of the difficulties of this pattern. What I would like to present you today is the following, this is the main goals of the talk. Let's see if I can manage to arrive to all of them. What I would like to show you is to put into relation, on the one hand, the defective left periphery of infinitive relatives, which is a very unknown part of the syntax of Romance languages, and some consequences at the interpretative level, which is the restricted model and temporal readings this construction have. What I would like to show you is that the fact that these constructions have a restricted periphery has a consequence on the possible interpretations they can get, and this is always my main goal here. My second goal will be try to connect these facts from relatives to infinitive WH relatives. With infinitive interrogative clauses, sorry. And I would try to show that we can find parallels with them. And it's an interesting question to see what's going on the left periphery of these two different constructions, because we know interrogatives are selected clauses, whereas relative clauses are not selected. So we have nice patterns. They pattern together in some aspects, but on the other hand, they are very different at the syntactic level. And the third point, I would like to extract some consequences for analysis of phenomena involving a rich left periphery. My main point will be what we know from relative clauses, non-finite relative clauses, can tell us if some analysis involving a rich left periphery are correct or not, because we will see that these relatives has no a reduced left periphery, so we cannot export many of the analysis we have for main clauses to this context. Okay, so we'll see if they fit into this pattern. And finally, and will be very tentative, is just open the discussion, and I will try to say something more next week, is to open a discussion on the best way to deal with these different defective clause patterns. We will see that there are different levels of missing structure in these clauses, but we are not very sure how to deal with. If they are a truncation problem, it's a kind of deletion, it's a kind of syncretism of different heads into just one head. So we have some questions here, some theoretical aspects to be discussed. These are the main goals. How I'm going into them? Okay, this will be the roadmap. I will first present you the basic data from non-finite relatives, then I will show you that these non-finite relatives have a very defective left periphery. They lack, for example, topic and focus, and all these elements arise in this periphery. And in my third part, I would like to connect this deficiency with the restricted model and possibly temporal readings that we find in these constructions. We try to show that the fact that the interpretation we have with these relatives is always of a root model interpretation, has to do with the availability or not of some structure in the left periphery. And then I will move to the consequences for some analysis we have seen in the literature dealing with the left periphery in order to explain certain phenomena. I will show you that if you connect this with what we know about our relative non-finite relatives, then we have a problem. That would be more or less the idea. And then I will finish with some brief conclusions. Okay. So let me go into the basic data. Okay. When you move to infinitive relatives in Romance, you have two flavors. You can get them with a relative pronoun or with a prepositional-like complementizer. I use this label, prepositional-like complementizer. I'm not getting into many details on these elements. I have clear ideas about what they are, but I'm not getting into many details. And there is a lot of literature on this, on many languages, from Italian, from Napoli, and Bianchi, then Spanish from Tavoes, then many data from Romanian, from Georgia, and obviously many data from, I think it's basically from Brazil, for European Portuguese, from Brito, Veloso, Duarte, and Magalhães, for example. Let's see some examples. The example in 1A, it's a typical case of a non-finite relative with a WH element. So what you have here is the antecedent, then you have the relative structure, in this case with a preposition, and then you have the infinitive. That's something they're very parallel in the structure with finite ones. Which is more interesting are the cases in 2. In these cases, what you have is something a bit different. What you have here is one element which introduces the relative. There is no WH element. There is no relative pronoun here. So in this sense, these are the equivalent of the relatives introduced by complementizer that. It could be more or less the parallel, okay? So you have here a preposition-like element, which is changing from language to language. In some languages is a, in other languages is de. You can find in Spanish por, para. You can find different elements in different languages, but they are always prepositional-like elements. And then you have the infinitival element, okay, as you can see here, and this is connected to the antecedent. Okay, there are typical examples where the antecedent is the direct object of this internal verb. Okay, and similar here in Sardinian. This causes here is the complement, is the antecedent of the complement of a null. We guess a null operator, relative operator of this verb facere. Okay, so these are the two basic structures we will discuss today. Are we sure that all these elements are really relatives? Yes, I think so. They involve the same relative gap configuration, and they are restricted with the same properties. For example, WH relatives have the same elements involved. If you have the WH element, the relative pronoun, you don't have the eclectic inside the sentence. So you find the same restriction you find with other relatives. So there is no clear difference. If you try to make extraction from this construction, this is impossible, which is something you expect if they are true relatives. Obvious, you can say, okay, maybe it's a problem because they are adjuncts, so it's another question. But I mean, they pattern what you expect. For example, if you try to make an extraction from a WH relative, for example, in 3A, you can see that that's wrong, completely wrong, impossible. And the same if you use, as you can see here, a prepositional-like element. Okay, it's the same problem, and the same in the Spanish. Okay, so I think this is quite incontroversial. So the first part, okay, they are true relatives clauses. That's my main point here. Okay, if you coordinate these elements with finite relatives, that's perfect. For example, you have the example here. You have the antecedent, las tierras. the lands, and then you have this element, which is a non-finite relative introduced by a preposition, and then you can coordinate it without any problem, as you can see here, with a finite relative, que hay que cuidar. So they can combine. The order is always the same, non-finite, finite. I don't know why, but it's probably question regarding the size of the elements. I don't know, but always the tendency is to have first the non-finite and then the second in the second place. If you try to change the order, they are not so nice, okay? And the same in Catalan. The books to bring to the school and that you must pay, okay? That's the same coordination. So at first sight, they are behaving as any other relative in our languages, okay? So we can, I think, more or less conclude that they are truly relative clauses. What's the problem? Obviously, the problem has to do with the ambiguity we can find with some elements which are causal or final adjuncts PPs. And this has been discussed by many people in the literature, as you can see here. For example, in blue, you can see elements which we can say they are truly relatives, prepositional-like relatives, okay? In Castile, there are many lands to be sound. Here, if you try to put the resuntive clitic, this is odd, which is what you expect if this is a relative, okay? So because you have some kind of relative operator here, so you cannot have a resuntive clitic here. Compare with the case in B. Here in B, we don't have a relative clause. This is a truly final adjunct PP, okay? So this is not a relative of tierras, this is something different. Here, the presence of the clitic is obligatory, okay? So there is a very clear contrast between these two cases. So this will be a clear case of a relative, and this will be a clear case of a final adjunct. So we have tests to show you that they're different, okay? And consider this other, this is new in the literature. I don't know why, but I mean, to me, it's very obvious. Typically, I don't know why, I mean, not much people has an explanation why this is the case, but relative clauses don't like the antecedent to be modified by a possessive. And this is the same happening to all relatives. It doesn't matter if they are finite or non-finite, okay? That's a general problem with relatives. You have a relative, the antecedent cannot have a possessive pronoun modifying it. If you compare the cases in 7a and b, you can see the difference. In 7a, it must be, this must be a relative clause. If you put the possessive, that's wrong, impossible, okay? You cannot say something, avergonzada escondió sus libros por leer. That's impossible. You can only say los libros por leer. That's the only possibility here. Compare with a finite adjunct PP. Here, there is no problem. You can use any of them because these elements are not modifying an antecedent. This is not the antecedent of a relative clause. So you can say, escondió sus libros para no discutir or por no discutir. Perfect. Okay, that's a typical adjunct interpretation of this element as an adverbial. You can use sus, you can use los, no problem at all. But if you are using a relative, you cannot use a possessive pronoun, okay? So you can see the difference here. These prepositional-like elements don't admit clitic resumption and are incompatible with a possessive modifying. So we have clear tests to tell you that these are not adverbial PPs, because adverbial PPs admit clitic resumption and are unaffected by the form of the MP. Okay, so we have a clear difference here between these two elements. This is a very important methodological point. If we don't take this into account, we get a mess. And many people are mixing things together. And then what we say is not enough, is not accurate enough for explaining the relatives, okay? And obviously, a last difference, this has been shown in the literature. One way to show the difference is to have this relative in a modifying a pronominal, a preverbal subject. In this case, you cannot get a final prepositional sentence here. So you have something like las tierras por sembrar. This can only be a modifier, a relative modifier of tierras. If you try to separate this element from here and moving to a final position, like it was an adverbial, this is totally impossible. and compare with a clear element, which is a typical final adverbial PP. That's impossible. And then you can say, las tierras están ahora inundadas para fertilizarlas. That's perfect. And you can see here, the clitic doubling, you can move this from the tierras, no problem at all. Okay, so this is clearly not a relative clause. And something similar has been pointed out for Portuguese. We'll talk in a minute about these para relatives in Portuguese, because they are, my point is that maybe they are a bit more different, okay? But that's the same idea. Os livros para ler nas feiras, that's okay. This is a relative construction modifying libros, but you cannot say something like para ler nas feiras, os livros estão encima da mesa. Why? Probably because obviously this is an estative, and you cannot get this interpretation as a final PP. So that's probably the context here, okay? So we have good reasons to separate this from other kinds of elements. And another second part, and this is important because, for example, in the Spanish grammar, in her great chapter on infinitives by María Luisa Hernández, that's, I mean, it's not a chapter, it's like a mini book. I mean, it's great. If you want to know about infinitives, you go there and then you find everything. And she's considering these sentences here. And her point here is saying, okay, when you have a prepositional infinitival relative, you can have many different prepositions. And she treats these cases like true prepositional infinitivals. Okay, true prepositional relative infinitivals. And my point is, no, this cannot be. Well, we'll see in a minute why this cannot be. My point here is that this is not the same. This is a different construction with different properties. These are predicative PPs. And this is something we can check easily. So this is something different. I'm not dealing with this here. For example, this element, this prepositional element can move and be separated from the presumably antecedent. For example, se encontró la casa sin fregar, you can say la casa, you dislocate this element, se la encontró sin fregar. Obviously, what you get here, you can see this is a secondary predicate. So these two elements, la casa and sin fregar, are totally independent. One is a complement, direct object, and the other is a predicative. So they can be separated. One, you can pronominalize one. You can change the order, as in C. Se encontró sin fregar la casa. Obviously, if this is a relative clause, that's impossible to obtain this. And obviously, if this is a relative clause, you cannot have the possessive here. And this is a comparison with true relatives. So if you compare them, you can see that they are not behaving the same. They're behaving very differently. The ones in blue are real infinitival relatives. What you have here is something different. They are secondary predicates, so I'm not taking them into account. So you can see there is a first task to clean the field of work. And finally, I come back to Portuguese. Probably we are not dealing with just one case. Maybe you have different prepositional infinitival relatives. For example, compare the ones in 14 with the ones in 15 in Brazilian, in European Portuguese. Compare the examples in 14. These are the most close to the ones we have been studying. O livro ler-lhes está na prateleira. You can see here, this is introduced by E. You don't have any possibility of having a subject here. The pronoun is following you find enclisis, not proclisis, and there is no way to have an inflected infinitival in European Portuguese, okay? So as you can see here, these are clear properties of this construction. When you move to the para, you find differences in the literature, obviously. So something I have to check. I know also that in Brazilian Portuguese, these cases with inflected maybe are disappearing, or they are not analyzed. They are not found in the same case as in European Portuguese. But the description is that with para, you can get in European Portuguese a full subject in preverbal position. You get proclisis, And you can get optionally an inflected infinitable. These are completely different from the properties here. In all the examples we will see in a minute, all go with this. Okay, we will not find any examples in Catalan, in Spanish, in Italian with preverbal subjects. All the examples will be involving enclisis, never proclisis. So this is the examples in 15 seem to be a different story. So to me, they are more structured here than there is here. That's my intuition. So what I'm proposing here should be applied to 14, but probably not to 15. 15 seems to be a more complex structure. Okay, so with these methodological points, we know that these constructions are relatives. They are different from final PPs, even though they have some connection, obviously, but they are different. They have different properties. So let's get into the second part. These constructions, these infinitable relative constructions, have a defective left periphery. Let's see. As you know, in Romance, unlike Germanic, topicalization, Romance critic left dislocation is widespread. You can find this construction in all contexts, in all subordinate contexts. That's the crucial part. Whereas topicalization seems to be a main clause phenomena, Romance critic left dislocation is found in all kinds of subordinations. Okay, this is something that, I mean, Lydian Hageman has been working on this for many years, and she has several ideas of why this is the case. Okay, I'm not getting into this, but this is the fact. So for example, in 16, you can see several contexts, subordinate contexts, where you can find a critic left dislocated element. And you can see in A, this is a completive subordination. So this is a complement of the verb. This is a complement of a noun. And in blue, you have the left dislocated element. And finally, this is interesting, in a relative clause, like the one in here, you can see that you can find a critic left dislocated element within the relative clause. You can see that this is introduced by en la que, this is Spanish, una novela en la que, and then the critic left dislocated element. Okay, you have the critic retaking this element. So this is what you find in all languages across Romance. Okay. What happens with our non-finite relatives? Different things. If you go to non-finite relatives, what you find is that you cannot get critic left dislocations in this position. Okay, after the prepositional like element, as you can see here in 17A and B, and after a relative pronoun, like in this example from Bianchi for Italian, the same examples for Catalan, okay, and Spanish. I'm just putting several languages at the same time, just to show you that this is not a special of a particular Romance language, but it's general. Whenever you have a non-finite relative, you cannot get a critic left dislocated element. Originally, for example, in work by Ritz in the 80s, he suggested maybe the problem has to do with the weak nature of this element. So he said, okay, maybe this is like a clitic, so it must be connected to the verb, so you cannot have room for anything in the middle. That could be a possible explanation. But then you move to WH relatives, and then you have the same problem. So you cannot say that the problem here has to do with the weak nature of this element here. So there is something else. So my point here is that this is not a problem of the nature of this element here or this element here. It's a basic problem of the structure you have here. You don't have room for topics in this structure. Okay, that would be my main point. And the same seems to be the case for foci. If you try to move to this preverbal position a contrastive focus element, then it's impossible. You can see examples here in French, in Catalan, and in Spanish, and the same example you can see here with a prepositional like relative and with a WH relative. The same problem is found. Okay, some people say, okay, maybe this is less bad. I mean, it's not as bad as this one. Maybe That's something we have to study. Maybe here we have a bit more structure. We'll see in a minute that this seems to be the case. So maybe in some cases we have some more room for elements here with WH than with prepositional like. We'll see in a minute. So for some people, maybe this is the case. But for me, I mean, they are really difficult to find. So you don't admit topics. You don't seem to admit focalized elements, so fronted foci, and you don't admit these kind of left peripheral elements related to polarity, like these emphasizing elements like yes or well. These typical elements appear in the left periphery of the sentence, as many people like Hernandez and other people have argued, but they are not found in these relatives. Okay, as you can see, examples from Spanish, for Catalan, this CK, which is the strong verum focus marker, and the same with B, which is typical in Spain, in Spanish. And then the same, as you can see here, with WH relatives. Again, the problem has nothing to do with the fact that you have a weak preposition here. Even when you have a strong pronoun, relative pronoun here, the possibility of having these elements is forbidden. Okay, at the very descriptive level, there seems to be, if we follow the standard periphery of sentence stemming from the work by Luigi Rizzi, that you have force at the top, then you have topic, focus, and then finite. This is missing in this structure. Okay, this is clearly missing. What we don't know is maybe this also is also missing as well. We don't know. That's another question. Okay, but these elements cannot appear in the structure. Obviously, as you can see here, there are several ways to deal with this. And we'll talk about them at the end of the talk. The point will be, okay, maybe this is squeezed in the structure and you have a force phrase, a finite phrase, but you don't have this. Something like selective truncation. Other people will tell, no, if you truncate everything. So if you have truncation at this point, you don't have anything else at the higher level. You don't have even force phrase. Okay, that could be another possibility. We'll see that maybe we need both. Maybe we need a radical truncation for preposition-like relatives and a selective truncation for WH. That's something that we'll see in a minute. Which are the consequences of this description of the data? Obviously, the first question is, if we are eliminating material in the left periphery, do we have any consequence at the interpretative level of these constructions? I will show you that we do. Okay, that will be my point in the set. The second part, how can we deal with this truncation in our standard analysis of the left periphery of sentence? Okay, what kind of operation is this truncation? It's a selective pruning, like, for example, some people argue, or is something more radical? You don't have all the material beside the point? Something we have to talk about. And obviously, how can we formalize this in our system? Okay, what kind of operation are we dealing with here? Let's move to the first point. Okay, if we don't have this match structure, do we have any consequences at the interpretative level? My point is yes. For example, model readings. These constructions, these infinitable relatives, has been described as typically model constructions. So they have a model reading. I mean, which is not surprising because infinitables do get this model reading. What is more important is the kind of reading you get. Typically, the model reading you get with these infinitables is systematically root in the descriptions you find. For example, if you consider, from the moment, let's consider prepositional-like elements, like paraísos por descubrir, ejercicios para corregir, la tasa de descuento por utilizar. In all these cases, what you get is a typical root interpretation, never an epistemic one. Okay, ability, obligation, necessity, depends on the kind of, typically obligation and necessity with para, but you can find differences, okay? But you never get the meaning of the possibility that of maybe that. No, you don't get this meaning with these cases. And even that's interesting. You can even have a model, a typical model like to be able, poder in Spanish or Catalan, and this element it's like expletive because it's not adding anything that you don't get in the structure before, because you get the same meaning. You can say el dinero para poder hacer esto, and you say el dinero para hacer esto, and they have the same meaning. So this poder here is adding this ability of meaning, but you already get this meaning in the structure if you don't get the poder. So you can find examples with the explicit model, very few ones, but you can also get them, and they are typically always with this root reading. Okay, and let's see what happens when you consider adverbs, modal adverbs. If these elements get a particular reading, you expect them to be compatible with the adverbs introducing the same meaning. Okay, so let's consider root modal adverbs like obligatorily, necessarily. If you get these elements, it's perfect. So the books to be obligatorily or necessarily read, that's perfect. And they appear typically in a postverbal position. Okay, that would be important in a minute. And the same with WH relatives. Okay, una persona en qui confia obligatoriament, necessàriament. Okay, you can see that this is what you expect. You get the root meaning, and obviously you get root modal adverbs. Then we move to the second part. What happens if you get in these constructions epistemic modal adverbs? That's the second part. And here, you find a very interesting difference. Okay. Oh, sorry, this should be wrong. Okay, 27b is wrong. I missed the asterisk. Okay. Consider in 27 you find prepositional infinitival relatives. With these, epistemic models are not allowed. They're very hard. And you don't get this els llibres per potser llegir. That's wrong, impossible. And the same in the Spanish. Los exámenes para ojalá corregir. That's impossible. These are epistemic. Remember, the root appear after the verb. Here when they appear before, but they are not allowed here. We'll move in a moment to cinque, obviously, as you can imagine. But this is important. When you move to WH, you find a difference. This is not described in the literature in Catalan and Spanish. It was my first intuition, and then I confront my intuition with other people, and they are not really good for me, but other people say, okay, they're not as bad as 27. And crucially, some people say, okay, la Maria és una persona en qui potser confiar. No, this is not as bad, for example, as 27a. What's the difference here? This is a WH. That makes a difference, okay? And this is a epistemic adverb. And the same in the Spanish. Interestingly, this has been described in the literature before for Italian. If you look at, for example, in the 80s, cinque was showing that in these cases, you can find this kind of epistemic adverbs. As you can see here, they are epistemic, okay? And they appear before preceding the verb, the infinitival verb. Un uomo al quale possibilmente presentare Maria. They are fine. Examples from Belletti, you find exactly the same. Qualcuno a cui probabilmente affidare questo tipo di incarico. The same. And interestingly, when you try to put this element after the verb, this is wrong. Okay, so the point is, prepositional-like elements don't allow epistemic adverbs at all. WH elements do allow them in a preverbal position. So there is a very interesting contrast here. How can we explain this? My point is, okay, this is suggesting that we have a difference in the size of the clause. And then let's move to cinque. What is Cinque telling us about this kind of adverbs? He's telling us that modal adverbs and root modality is found in a very low position, very close to the verb, whereas epistemic modality is encoded in a very high position. My idea is, okay, maybe this is the explanation for the difference. In our prepositional-like elements, we are losing the structure at this point. So we don't have room for these modal epistemic adverbs, only for root. With WH relatives, maybe we have more room, and then we have room for this and obviously for this. But obviously the verb is moving in the middle. Okay, that could be more or less the point. And this seems to fit very nice. Okay, seems to be very nice with the pattern. Let's see a consequence. Let's see another consequence regarding this. And a second property typical of these constructions has to do with the spectral restrictions. We have seen the model, okay? Typically for prepositional-like are always root. They can be root or epistemic for the other. And typically these constructions don't allow very easily, as reported in the literature, perfective forms. So typically all the literature say that they reject the perfective aspect. And this is true, but only for prepositional-like elements. I have found several examples, not many, I agree, not many, but you can find examples like this in the corpus. Let's look at them. And they are WH relatives with an infinitival in a perfective form. That's impossible if you have something like a prepositional here. Something like una madre dominante por haber mantenido una relación idípica. That's totally out. But when you have a WH element here, you can get this perfective reading in some cases. It's not very common, because in many cases, the interpretation of this construction is prospective, is toward the future. But in some cases, you can get this past perfective meaning. Si pudieras escoger un periodo de la historia en el que haber vivido, ¿dónde iríais? That's the same. Haber vivido. En el cual haber introducido. You can see. Only with WH relatives. So we are finding that these two infinitival relatives are defective, but they are not alike in the room they have in the periphery. So they are defective. They don't admit topic and focus, but besides this, they have a difference. WH relative seems to have more structure and allow more modal and spectral readings than prepositional-like elements. Okay, so we have something like this. That's a very descriptive way to put the things. So it seems to be, I'm not sure about the exact point where you are doing the truncation, but it seems to be the case that prepositional-like relatives seems to have very, very, very few structure in the left periphery, probably just finite phrase. Okay, that's what seems to be the case. And at this point is where you get the prepositional-like element. Okay, this de, this per, this a in Portuguese. And the root modality is found in a low position. So when you find a root adverb here, you find in this position is not affected by truncation, and then when the verb moves to tense, then appears in postverbal position, no problem at all. But when you have a prepositional-like element, you don't have room for epistemic adverbs, which are higher in the structure, as Cinque shows us. Okay, so we need more room when you have a WH infinitival relative, and probably you have a unique force phrase for encoding all the positions in the sentence. Maybe this element is moving at this position here. The WH relative is moving here. I will see in a minute. Okay, so this is more or less the my intuition arising from this data. Okay. Do we have independent evidence for this? This is a very good observation that Gemma Rigau told me. So why don't you look at root infinitable like comprar eso yo, this kind of Pedro comprar eso, this kind of root infinitables with this kind of interrogative surprise meaning. These constructions we have an infinitable are restricted in exactly the same way as our prepositional like infinitables. Okay, they admit root modal adverbs necesariamente. They don't admit epistemic adverbs at all. Something like María probablemente irá allí, impossible. Obviously, you can say, okay, it's what you expect. You don't expect a surprise, exclamative meaning with something that is not sure. That's okay, but this is what you find here. And as you can see here, they don't admit the perfective aspect. So they are behaving just like our prepositional infinitable relatives in this particular sentence. And obviously, this seems to be related to the truncation operation found in this construction as well. So there seems to be independent evidence for this kind of analysis. Details obviously are a hard part, but the main idea, as you can see, I think it makes sense. So let's put everything together, okay? So let's move to prepositional infinitable relatives. This preposition is not a preposition, it's a complementizer in the finite head, and is a typical marker of the non-finite nature of the clause. And it's the same element you can find in other constructions, for example, in several constructions introducing infinitables in Catalan, Italian, or Spanish with a de, for example. You can introduce these infinitable sentences, not relatives, but other kinds of infinitables with this de, okay? Which is not a preposition. If we assume something like a rating analysis, this is not crucial for my proposal. Okay, you can follow Cinque's analysis with the double head. It's more or less the same idea. You get something like this. You get the elements here, okay? This libres is the element that moves here. Is the noun that moves to this position. And this is selected by the determiner. This is the typical racing analysis. If you want a more traditional one, then you will have something like a DP here, and libres will be the antecedent, and then this will be a null operator moving to this position. But the idea is more or less the same. And this is the head of finite, which is a preposition-like element marking this non-finite sentence. And then the verb moves here, and then you get the necessariamente this root adverb after the verb. There is no place here for anything like an epistemic adverb, as you can imagine. And obviously, there is no room here for topics, for focus, or anything else. That's more or less what we get here. That's very easy. But it has some consequences as well at the theoretical level. You can imagine that whenever you have this, you must assume that the analysis of movement of relatives is different in the case of prepositional like and WH. We are assuming that the relative element is moving to different places in one construction and in the other. We don't have a unified analysis for relatives, okay? We'll see in a moment. If you move to WH, as you can see here, the analysis is more complex. You have more structure here. The movement is the same, okay? You move the verb here, and this element is moving probably through finite phrase to this position here. Obviously, you have this typical movement of the noun here, and then you get the final order. Crucially, as I told before, you are assuming that in these constructions that the relative element is in fourth phrase, whereas in the previous case, the relative element is at least here. So this is different. So we must assume that a unified analysis for relatives must place relatives in different places, okay? Well, that would be more or less the proposal for these elements. Okay. Which are the consequences we get from this analysis to other analysis? My point here is that we can use these relatives, these non-finite relatives, to check the predictions of several analyses. The point is, if you lack part of the periphery of sentence, as you can see in these examples, we lack focus, we lack topic. If you don't have these elements here in the left periphery of sentence, whenever you have an analysis, assuming that you need to move something to this periphery, then your prediction will be that should not be possible with these relatives because they don't have the room for this movement. Okay, that could be the question. Let's see one example. For example, contrasted focus in situ. Okay, there is an ongoing discussion of this, and Ritz is not very explicit, but in some places he's suggesting, more than offering the analysis, that this contrasted focus in situ is something like involving movement at the left. So he's suggesting that this is like WH in situ. So whenever you have this contrasted focus in situ, it's not moving visibly, but moving at the left. But it's, in all cases, it's moving to the focus phrase in the left periphery of sentence. Okay, that's the main point. Obviously, the prediction is that if you don't have this position in relatives, you don't have contrasted focus in situ, because this element should move at the left to a position you don't have. And this is expected to be wrong. But this is not the case. You can have these elements here, and obviously with clear markers of contrastivity. And you can see here, or even exhaustivity. Els llibres per llegir a classe I no pas a casa, this is a typical contrastive focus, in situ, as you can see here. Yes, then if this is possible, and it seems to be the case to be possible, then you have to assume a different analysis for this contrastive focus. You cannot say this is moving to the left periphery at the left, because there is no left periphery to move on. Okay, so we have to move to assume other possibilities. One would be say, okay, the way that Samuel Lodovici treats these cases, okay, this is really in situ. It's not moving at all. Other people say, okay, it's moving, but to a lower periphery next to the BP. This is, for example, the proposal in my thesis, the ideas by Belletti in 2004, and the ideas from Luis Lopez and other people. So this seems to give evidence for this analysis and put some doubts on the LF movement analysis of these constructions. Okay, so that's a good prediction. Okay, what about another construction? Let's take right dislocation. Okay, right dislocation has been analyzed several ways. One of a very common way to analyze right dislocation is assuming that right dislocation is just left dislocation plus remnant movement of the tense phrase. Okay, then so you do left dislocation. If you don't do nothing else, then you get left dislocation. And if you move the sentence then to the left, then you get right dislocation. So the left dislocate and the right dislocate are landing in the same position. The only difference is if you move the remnant or not. That's a very typical proposal, for example, by Cardinaletti or even Samuel Lodovici. What's the prediction here? The prediction here is, if this is the case, if you need the left periphery, the higher left periphery to derive right dislocation, the prediction is that this should not be possible in these constructions. And this seems to be the case. Okay, against my my inner feeling, which is I don't like this remnant analysis of right dislocation. But when I find the data, I mean, yeah, it's giving support to this, because when you try to put these dislocators here, they are really wrong. They can only be understood with a parenthetical reading, not with a typical right dislocation reading. Okay. So many people tell me, no, okay, oh no, this is really wrong for me. Only with a parenthetical intonation, maybe. Otherwise, they are not right dislocation. And this is strange because right dislocation is allowed in Catalan in any position, in any subordination, even subordinating in a non-finite context. Okay, but not in these relatives. So this is suggesting that you need this left periphery in order to derive this right dislocation. So it's favoring this topic phrase movement plus random movement analysis. So have nice evidence for independent analysis, okay? Or let's see, for example, this, I don't know how much time I'm wasting. Let me see. Okay. Oh, I have to, no, I'm finishing. So, for example, let's see this analysis by Hagemann discussing the case of gapping. And she's arguing, following other people before, that whenever you have gapping, these elements are not in situ. The remnants of gapping are moving to the left periphery of sentence. For example, to topic, phrase, and focus phrase. This is the example, for example, in 37. Okay, and the schools, which is the topic, moves to topic phrase, and this moves to focus phrase, and you get the contrast in both of them. The same structure here. Again, what could be the prediction if you don't have room for this topic phrase and this focus phrase? The prediction is that this gapping should not be possible, at least for the analysis from Hagemann, saying that this topic phrase and this focus phrase are in the left periphery of the sentence, okay? But they are, okay? They are possible, as you can see in the examples in 39. These are very new examples as well. So maybe some people are still, I have to confront with other people. My intuition is that these are really possible. There's no problem here. Los libros para leerle a María en clase y a Juan en casa, problem, no problem at all. Okay? So according to Hagemann, this is in topic phrase and this is in focus phrase. But you don't have topic phrase and you don't have focus phrase in this construction. Okay? And the same here. Obviously, you have to say that if they are in focus and topic, there is a topic and a focus in another position, lower in the structure, okay? In this lower BP OTP area, like suggested, for example, by Cecchetto, myself, Belletti, and Lopez. So here you have evidence that maybe you have a second focus position lower in the structure again, okay? Okay, and that's finishing, that's opening the issue. If we have defective structures and we have several possibilities, as for example, we have seen that some constructions have more room, more space, and others are more restricted, how can we encode this in syntax? One possibility is the traditional one. It's saying that this is truncation, or tree pruning, or exfoliation, or remove, or class reduction, as you want. But other possibility would be, okay, we are not cutting the structure. What we are doing is that we are making a syncretism of different heads. We have focus, we have topic, we have force, but we make them a syncretic head, but we don't have the whole structure. We have the features, but we don't have the full structure. That's another way to look at the problem. And this, for example, the proposal by Baunas and other people, Giorgi, Bianchi. So there are two possible ways. And maybe we'll have to say at the end that we have both. That's another point. For example, the data that Friedman and Belletti show is that there is differences between truncation and production of clauses when you look at them from the acquisition point of view. Okay, so there are probably differences. So maybe we need both. Okay, I'm just opening the discussion, not offering a solution here. My personal way is probably going for syncretism. That will be my personal choice. But I don't have arguments enough at this point to defend it. So to conclude, okay, we have seen that these infinitable relatives display a very defective left periphery of different sizes. They are of different sizes, but they have in common excluding topic phrase and focus phrase. They seem to agree on this. Prepositional infinitable relatives have a extremely impoverished structure, probably just finite phrase. So they don't have the possibility to express anything else like root modality. They don't allow epistemic modality, and they don't allow a perfective aspect as well. So there is a very impoverished structure. On the other hand, WH infinitable relatives and their interrogative kins have a richer structure, probably force phrase, and they allow epistemic modality. at this point, even though they don't allow focus on topic for reasons unknown at this point. And this might have important consequences for our current analysis of contrastive focus, critic right dislocation, or gapping, as we have seen in a moment. If you rely on movement to this periphery, you have a playground for testing your hypothesis with the relatives. And we have seen that some of the data are very clear in one direction. And finally, this is the conclusion. We still have a very poor understanding of the formal operation they are involved in these defective peripheries. What's going on? We have a big structure and then we reduce it. We get a reduced structure from the beginning. We still don't know. So there is still more evidence needed in order to get more answers to this point. And probably part of this evidence will come from acquisition and probably from the study of other languages involving this kind of truncation operations, like, for example, Creoles, and then maybe from heritage language speakers. Okay, so this is something on the road, and we'll see what happens in the future. And I finish. Muito obrigado. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Villalba, for such an enlightening talk.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So now I'm going to address some of the questions that we received from our audience. So if you have any questions, please, you can still send us through the YouTube chat, right? Mm-hmm. And Professor, I'm going to read these questions that people mail us, and these questions will be posted here and in the Zoom chat for your convenience. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. I can move to the YouTube if you need. I can do it. Okay. I can open a window. So so even easier.
Oh, okay. But we will. Okay. So to begin with, a student from NAG group has just emailed us the following question. So if infinitive relatives have an inherited model reading and also a prospective temporal interpretation, one might be wonder which are the corresponding projection conveying these two interpretations when the structure is built up, as there is a couple of model-like functional projection which could potentially convey this reading.
So, yeah, that's a yeah. As always, this is always a difficult way to get, because we have a very schematic idea of how these elements are put into the structure, and we can only work with comparing two positions more or less, and that's not easy in many cases. And obviously in many cases you also get semantic incompatibilities, which makes the test difficult. So for example, as I said before, the typical reading of these elements is prospective. They are typically projected into the future, which is what you expect if they have this root meaning, or things like that. And also if they have the epistemic reading. So then you don't expect them to have this perfective aspect available. But in some cases you get this perfective aspect. So maybe you have to assume that it's available, even though not always active. The way to explain this is complicated, because you have to make many clear assumptions of the position of these elements. I was just offering a very sketchy view. So we know from if we take Cinque's work, we know that obviously root and epistemic are at very different levels. That's quite clear. And the case of aspect is not so clear. That's my point. So I'm doubting on this, because that's right. If you are making the truncation here, then you have to say something about this perspective reading. I don't know. Still, I'm sure about the models. I'm not so sure about the aspect and terms. Okay. So we have to see in the future, right, to see more evidence for this. Okay. So I share the concerns of the question. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. A student from La Casa Group sent us the following question. I'm going to read. How can one make sure that in Catalan examples corresponding to English, so the books to read necessarily, the sentence final adverb necessarily is a lectio of necessity, the ontic adverb, and not a manner adverb, meaning in a necessarily manner. The reason why one can ask this question is observation by the literature on adverbs according to which high adverbs cannot appear sentence finally unless they are clearly prosodically marked. So
I see. I guess that in this case, you should obviously add intonation here, and the other way would be to combine this with a modal element in the same. If you can get this possibly or not possibly necessarily with another element carrying the model, the manner reading, you would expect them to be different. Okay, so you don't have to manner adverbs in the same position. So okay, so that could be another way. So os ibas para leer necesariamente deprisa. Then you should have to make sure that this adverb is not modifying the in a hurry. Okay, something like necessarily in a hurry. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I have to check combinations of modal adverbs to make clear that they are not having a manner reading, and then you get them in the final position. Okay, that's a good point.
Okay.
I have the idea how to do it, but I should do it.
All right. Another student from the La Casa research group has just emailed the following question. So while in infinitive relative epistemic adverbs are excluded both post-verbally and prior-verbally, you mentioned that in WH relatives, things are less clear and pre-verbal epistemic adverbs would fit better in this construction than post-verbally. Should this pattern be due independent reason like verb raising?
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. That's the point of many of these cases. For some strange reason, we don't, not a strange reason. From my analysis, you predict that there is nothing possible to appear between the preposition and the verb, because this position would be the position of the subject, the plural subject. You have the finite phrase, the headed phrase, you have the preposition, and then you have the TP, the preverbal null subject, and then the verb intent. The prediction is that you don't find any kind of possible adverb here. This is what you find. It doesn't matter the kind of adverb. Even a temporal adverb is not allowed, like forever or always. So everything you find here must appear after the verb. But then it moves the point of why there is a difference with the WH. In the case of the WH, there seems to be that the verb is moving higher in the structure. That should be the case. And this is something that I have to look into the details. I wasn't very interested in the position of the verb at this point, but truly that makes a point. Yeah. So I have to look into the position of the verb, and it seems to be the case that it's lower in the case of prepositional relatives, but maybe higher in the case of WH. Why should it be the case? Maybe there is some, some criterion requiring the verb and the WH element to appear in the same position, in the same projection, and then that forces the movement of the verb. I don't know, but I have to look. Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. Oh, you have very good students. Making very good questions.
Students continue their question in Brazilian.
Okay, go ahead.
If we take a verb with 3 arguments, the sentence is totally fine. So a Maria não é uma pessoa a quem possivelmente dar presente. Maria is not the person.
Yeah. That's nice.
Ou a Maria não é uma pessoa a quem oferecer possivelmente presentes. Maria is not a person to give possible gifts. So.
You have a contrast. You have both possibilities. Yeah. That should be obviously that. My point here has to do with the movement of the verb. I cannot get any other explanation here. So it seems like the verb is moving in one case it's moving higher, and I don't know. I don't have this. These are the second possibility is very strange it's very difficult to obtain in Catalan or Spanish. I guess that you should get some kind of parenthetical reading to get there. So that's very nice examples. Yeah. I have to copy them.
Nice.
Yeah, nice.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
No.
Thank you for our question at YouTube chat. So now, since no other questions have arrived, I'd like to ask if there's someone here in your Zoom chat, in your Zoom room, who want to ask you a question directly to Xavier. So just turn on your microphone and ask him, please. Okay, Sandra.
Yeah.
Hi, Sandra.
Thank you, Professor Xavier, for your chance talking. I love it.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.
I was thinking about, don't you think the patterns regarding the difference between infinitival relatives and WH relatives in Italian and Catalan are related to the verb must rise or not within close structure, and as epistemic adverbs must precede the infinitive, while root adverbs must follow it.
That's for sure. That's my point. Yeah. I guess that this is the best way to deal with this, because we know that in our languages, then that could be very interesting to make a contrast with French, because we know that movement of the verb in French is not exactly the same like in Italian or Catalan. We know that from Pollock's work many years ago. So maybe it could be interesting to make this difference concerning the infinitives. And these are mixing things, because even though we have this difference in verb movement, in all the cases, the clitic is always in enclitic position, unless the cases from Portuguese that we saw before, which is a very interesting case, because the only things that is different is para relatives in European Portuguese. When you have the subject, eu, les ler un libro. Then you have the subject, you have preverbal, proclitic, the verb. So it seems like the verb is not moving so much in these cases. I don't know. That's the only. But I would like to look, for example, into French, if you can find this difference in terms of verb movement, because it's something we know from other constructions, and particularly from the work by Pollock about infinitivals in French, that they typically have proclisis, which is not the case in many other Romance languages. So there is something, I guess that movement of the verb has something to do here.
Okay.
And maybe the case that you have a WH element might have some role here, because you need some kind of necessity to have the verb and the WH in some configuration together, more like a WH criterion a la Rizzi. What you don't need with prepositional-like elements. I don't know. That could be a possibility.
Okay.
Another possibility would be if you are filling the finite phrase, the finite head, by a prepositional-like element, you don't have the possibility to have the verb moving here. What you can do if you have the WH, you don't have this element here, and then you have the possibility to move the verb higher to this position in finite phrase. That could be another clear difference. But I have to spell out the analysis. I hope that next week I can show some more details of, because they are very things I've been thinking of, but I not still have put all of them together. But I agree with you that the position of the verb has something to do with this.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
No, thank you to you for the questions. That's you are putting the the finger on the yeah, that's true. Because you are finding exactly the same problems I found. So I'm very glad to see that I'm failing at the same point. Because you are pointing the good questions, as far as I can tell.
I have a question. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Xavier.
Obrigado.
Very, very cartographic talk. Thank you, and thank you for supporting our Zoom na cartografia. My question is, You've argued that infinitival relatives would have a defective left periphery and gave interesting pieces of evidence supporting such an analysis in terms of truncation. One question to ask is whether medial-like categories from the left periphery, if we consider, for instance, further developments on the categories entering the left periphery, such as modifier P, though that place where, for instance, adverb move, adverbs raise in Ritzy 20 and 4, for instance, to value the modifier feature. The question would be if a modifier like projection is present, one would ask where is the cutting point within the left periphery where truncation applies, and if it is open for cross-linguistic variation in Romance. Look, it seems possible to project a modifier P in these constructions, at least in Brazilian Portuguese, with a high adverb fronted. I will give the example.
Sure.
As terras, por evidentemente, ou provavelmente cultivar no verão, estão no interior de São Paulo. The lands for evidently or probably to be sown in the summer are in the countryside of the São Paulo state.
That's nice. With these adverbs, I support the idea of having this modifier phrase. Maybe we have cross-linguistic variation. That would be a possibility. And when I look at the data from Portuguese, that's my impression, because you have like more structure here. The examples with preverbal subjects, these examples like you with this element here. But we also have always the problem with, for example, these kind of evidential adverbs. They tend to be in many cases like parentheticals and can appear in many different positions, mixing. So I'm not saying that they are not in this position, but we need also some kind of confirmation from a prosodic analysis to make sure.
I agree.
That could be. So I'm not closing this position, but I would like to be sure about the exact position of these elements, because I have the same problem with evidement, these kind of evidentials, or these elements like commitment elements that certainly these kind of elements, these appear in many different positions. I have not considered them for the moment, but it could be nice to see which kind of elements you are allowed to have here. My impression is that in Catalan and Spanish and Italian, you don't have many possibilities here, but we have to look at other languages. So I guess that in French and Portuguese, and maybe we'll find differences between European and Brazilian Portuguese. That's my intuition. I have no. So this is something I would like to talk with you next week, because I still have.
My pleasure.
I still have very few data from Brazilian Portuguese on this. We have many good descriptions from Brito, Veloso, Magalhães from European Portuguese. But what happens in Brazilian Portuguese that we know allows some things that other Romance languages don't. So that could be a point for cross-linguistic variation. And how is truncation applying? I don't know. I don't know. Because the problem here has to do with I don't know, maybe what we call truncation are different things acting together. For example, one typical, when we begin talking about truncation, we came from a framework where truncation is something that children begin to learn. So it's something that is defective because it's too complex to get the higher structure. That's more or less the truncation hypothesis by Ritzy, Hageman. So we don't get this because this is too complex. But this doesn't seem to be the case in this case. For example, prepositional relatives are very simple. They have very few structure, but they are not found in acquisition studies for children. They first acquire the higher finite relative, and then after they move to the other. And the same happens, as Villalba shows, with participial relatives. Participial relatives are they have very few possibilities in the left periphery, but they are also acquired later on. So simplicity in the structure can be seen on both sides from the acquisition point of view, but there seems to be that this simplicity is the result, as Villalba put it, of reduction. So once you get the whole structure, then you reduce. In other cases, you don't get the whole structure still, and then you grow the tree. So they are mixing possibilities, and I don't have the answer for the moment, and maybe in the future I won't. I want as well.
Okay,
but I'm trying. I'm trying.
That's fine. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to you. Obrigado.
Okay, there's anyone from La Casa and Egg here in the Zoom room who wanna ask a question to Professor Villalba? Anyone? Okay. So Sandra, Achilles, would you like to say some final words so we can wrap up?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Xavier, for having accepted our invitation and for your thought-provoking conference.
Thank you
I
very
would
much.
like to thank the audience from Brazil and from abroad for being here with us today. I would like to thank the students from La Casa and NEG. Thank you very much and see you next month.
Yeah, next month, which is next week.
Next week, yeah. Yeah. Dear Professor Xavier, thank you very much for this illuminating talk and also for supporting our Zoom na cartografia. Please,
whenever you need.
when we finish this broadcast, Professor Xavier, don't leave the room because we
Sure.
wanna take a pic with you, okay?
Great, okay, I'll stay.
And since we are now approaching the end of this event, we are delighted to announce our next Zoom na Cartografia guests, Professor Marcos Lunguinho from the University of Brasília, Brazil, and Professor Patrícia Rodrigues from the Federal University of Paraná. Their talk is going to be the 27th of October, same time, and they will give a talk entitled Evaluative Pragmatic Markers in Brazilian Portuguese, a cartographic perspective. So thank you for your support and see you on the 27th of October. And long life to synthetic cartography.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Achilles. Thank you, Professor Sandra. And thank you so much, Professor Villalba, for being here with us today. See you next week in SPEC.
See you.
And thank you all who attend the conference. It was a great pleasure